Welcome to Watchtower History. This is the famous article. This Awake article. Are you also excommunicated? And I've heard it said about this article that the idea that the article is suggesting is that the disfellowship or shunning practices has a pagan origin. And there's some quotations here that seems to suggest that. But what is this article saying? And what are those articles saying in their original context? Stay tuned. We'll get into that. So the first quotation here is from the Catholic Encyclopedia. It says, with the foregoing exceptions, infidels, pagans, Mohammedans, and Jews, all who have been baptized are liable to excommunication, even those Protestants who have never belonged to the true church, since by their baptism they are really her subjects, though of course rebellious ones. Moreover, the church excommunicates not only those who abandon the true faith to embrace Protestant schism or heresy, but likewise the members of heretical and schismatic communities who have been born therein. So what is this quote saying? If you were just to take this quote alone, what do you think it's saying?
A lot of people are exempt from it by reason of not being a Christian, for one, and church is only excommunicating those who abandon the true faith.
Abandon the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And so I think they're quoting it. It looks like they're
true faith, yeah.
Yeah, they're quoting it because they're trying to suggest that the Catholic Church sees everyone outside of the Catholic Church as disfellowshipped.
Who else does
that? Who else does that? Yeah.
Who else does that?
Paul, who else does that?
I'll let the viewer decide. Anyone watching this can decide on their own. If you have to tell them, there's no point because they won't believe you anyway.
So basically they're saying the Catholic Church is going too far on this. And the next quotation in here is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And this is the one that gets the most attention. This is the one where we've been asked on the channel in the comment section, what are the origins of these things? So here's what the Awake article says. Where then did this practice originate? The Encyclopedia Britannica says that papal excommunication is not without pagan influence, and its variations cannot be adequately explained unless account be taken of several non-Christian analogues of excommunication. And the Awake writer says, the superstitious Greeks believed that when the excommunicated person died, the devil entered the body, and therefore, in order to prevent it, the relatives of the deceased cut his body in pieces and boiled them in wine. Even the Druids had a method of expelling those who lost faith in their religious superstitions. It was therefore after Catholicism adopted its pagan practices in AD 325 that this new chapter in religious excommunication was written. Now we see how the Awake magazine is quoting this statement from Britannica, and we see how they're treating it, right? So go ahead.
So where are they getting then all those latter facts from of where all that came from?
Okay, well, if you were to just read that paragraph with this quotation, how do you understand this quotation? What is the Awake trying to say? Because it took me a long time to wrap my mind around it, but when it clicked, it really clicked for me.
That indirectly, it's saying it's pagan in one aspect.
Okay, so they're saying that Disfellowship Doctrine has pagan origins.
In essence, that's what they're saying.
Okay, that's how Awake's trying to present it. I really think that's how they're trying to present it. Sort of. So let's look at Britannica. And I pulled up that exact article from that exact year. I had the 1910 Encyclopedia Britannica. I'm gonna read the Awake again, and then I'm gonna read Britannica, and listen for the difference or the similarities. Right? Very carefully. The Awake says the Encyclopedia Britannica says that papal excommunication is not without pagan influence. Quote, and its variations cannot be adequately explained unless account be taken of several non-Christian analogues of excommunication. Unquote. Notice where the quotation is. Britannica says, the praxis of Christian discipline, moreover, has never been wholly independent of Jewish and pagan influences, and its variations cannot be adequately explained unless account be taken of several non-Christian analogues of excommunication. What difference do you see there?
That the Christian discipline has never been wholly independent of Jewish and pagan influences.
So it had Jewish influence. Okay? And this Christian discipline, they're talking about which Christians? I think they're talking about the way the Catholics did it. And so, right, this is why Awake is quoting it, because they're saying the Catholic Church is taking disfellowship too far.
Well, they've always tried to differentiate between disfellowshipping and excommunication.
Okay.
Although they're one and the same.
Yeah.
Thing the way they applied.
So, is Britannica saying that Judaism and Christianity got the idea from the pagans? I don't think that's what Britannica is saying. I think when I read it and I'm thinking about the quotation of how Awake is using it, and I'm trying to understand it as its whole in the entire article, there's a line here that stands out more than all the others. And Britannica says, but more influential than any of these has been the ancient Jewish practice. So they're saying that the origins were in the Jewish concepts from Judaism, but the pagans took it further. And when you get to the Catholics, they borrowed the idea of how the pagans used disfellowship to take it beyond how Judaism was using it.
So basically, then what it's saying is more or less the practice sort of started with the Jews on how they handled their people.
Yeah.
Paganism became before Christianity. They borrowed from the Jews and took it to another level.
Or even if they didn't borrow from the Jews, they took this idea of disfellowship to a whole other level, just like you said. Yeah.
And then the Catholic Church came in and took it even beyond to a whole excommunicating level.
Yeah. I really think that's what Britannica is saying. So the origins in the paganism isn't as important as I used to think it was. It's how it was applied. So it's not the doctrine itself, it's how the doctrine was applied, how it was used. And why am I saying that? I'm going to read a couple quotations. It has been already said that the use of excommunication as a part of Christian discipline is based on the precept of Christ and on the apostolic practice. The general principles which ought to be observed can be easily gathered from the New Testament writings, but the church appears to have been left for the most of the practical details of the guidance of reason and experience. The New Testament gives us some concepts about it, but how to apply it is where the church went. They applied it too harshly. They went too far with it.
And again, who else did that?
Yeah, a very good question. It's a very good question to keep asking. Now, here's some examples that Britannica uses in its explanation. So the stricter or more Montanistic party held that for those who have been guilty of such sins as theft, fraud, denial of the faith, there should be no restoration to the church fellowship, even in the hour of death. On this point, the provincial synods of Iliberis, Elvira in 305 and Ancira in 315 subsequently came to conflicting decisions. But the excommunication was on all hands regarded as being medicinal in its character. It's noteworthy that the word avophia had fallen into disuse about the beginning of the 4th century, and that throughout the same period, no instance of the judicial use of the phrase can be found. So Britannica, again, is really using it how Awake is using it. I don't think Awake is taking it out of context, unusual enough, but how Watchtower applied it went beyond. They end up doing what they're talking against. So another quote here from Britannica. A new chapter in the history of church censure may be said to have begun with the publication of those imperial edicts against heresy, the first of which dates from 380. Till then, exclusion from church privileges had been a spiritual discipline. Merely, thenceforward, it was to expose a man to serious temporal risks. Excommunication still continued to be occasionally used in the spirit of genuine Christian fidelity, as by Ambrose in the case of Theodosius himself in 390. But the temptation to wield it as an instrument of secular tyranny too often proved to be irresistible. In the formula used by Synesius in 410, which is to be found in Bingham and other works of reference, we already find the attention of magistrates specially called to the censured person. The history of the next 1,000 years shows that the magistrates were seldom slow to respond to the appeal.
And it's showing a progression earlier, how it went.
And so what Britannica is saying is that they saw how far the pagans took it, basically, and they started taking it that far. So the origins of disfellowship or shunning are not from the pagans, it's from the Jewish and Christian scriptures, but how it's applied and going beyond what the scriptures say was borrowed from the pagans. I think that's the difference in how I understand it than a lot of others, or a lot of others, and how I've seen it explained. But it makes sense to me in just reading through the context. And it's interesting that they mentioned Theodosius here. I have a coin, an ancient coin from Theodosius himself, or one of Theodosius's ancient coins.
So, in a nutshell, on the Awake article on this in January of 1947, it's basically showing how, while the Awake was more or less condemning or the practice of the excommunication, they went therefore afterward and took it to the level that they took it, which was they were condemning.
Yeah, so exactly.
That's basically the whole nutshell of the Awake magazine presentation here.
Exactly. That's exactly, if I were to summarize it, that's exactly the point in a simple nutshell. And when did they do that? They did it in 1952.
The 40s, like everything else, they talk about it. It was just starting. I had the recollection that in the 50s, that's when it really, okay, we made the law, we created the rules, now here it comes. And they started enforcing it. Because I thought the 50s was when that really started hitting heavy.
Yeah, it did. And we remember, we asked this of Penton. And asked why he thought Knorr did that. And he just, his response was that he was quite the dictator. But it took him some time to do it. There's some speculation as to why this happened in the 1950s.